In the beginning, right? We've heard those words before, those mighty words. Very first chapter of the Bible. In the beginning. In the beginning, the world was out of order. If you read that account in the Genesis passage, the earth was without form. It was void. And it says darkness was upon the face of the earth. And the Spirit of God was moving over the waters. I believe that what's the correct New Revised Standard says, covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters, spinning. You can close your eyes and see this. There's this mass that's forming, and there's this sense of God's breath. God's Spirit is moving around, circling creation. When we say things are out of order, usually, if you go to a fountain drink machine or a candy machine, and there's a sign that says out of order, we know what that means. It means it doesn't work. If you think about that creation story, it's this sense of chaos and just things not working well. There's like an out of order sign hung on the earth at the beginning, but then God starts to hover around and rotate around, and creation begins to form up. It begins an ordering. God is ordering creation around His will. It's an amazing story of creation. Now, oftentimes we think about spinning and moving, and for me, the cliche that comes up is this idea of life moving too fast. My head is spinning, right? No one in here has ever felt like that. You've never felt like your head was spinning around, I'll bet. But when it does happen, when it happens to me, I feel sort of out of sorts, a bit out of order. My world is not moving correctly. And it tends to tell me that rotation and arrangement in life, it matters, doesn't it? It matters how life is arranged. If it's arranged around something that works, or if it's rotating in the wrong way. I thought about, I used to have an old Nissan truck, and it was a manual shift truck. And then those of you that, not many people drive these manual shift transmissions anymore, but you know what happens if you're going forward and you try to put that baby in reverse, what happens? It makes a great little noise, doesn't it? That grinding, that screeching noise. There's a rotation, it's working, it's in order, but whoa, if you mess with that and you begin to engage in a different rotation, a different order, it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. So what about our lives? Does it make a difference if there's an order to our lives? I don't know how it is for you, but in my life, it never seems to go along in this perfectly straight. It probably works for you, but for me, it never goes in this perfectly straight, arranged order, My life sort of goes up and it sort of goes down. It's around. There's lots of bends and curves. So I guess for me, life travels in cycles. And it makes a difference, doesn't it? What I focus on in those moments, it can color how I see the world. It can color how I see you and how I feel about things. Because if my world is not centered appropriately, is not arranged just right, I get out of sorts. My head spins. So, as God created, God breathed beings, what we arrange ourselves around, it really matters. Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And another way, a very simple way to say that is, what should be the center focus of my life? What's the center point? If I have to have my life spinning around one thing, what should that be? And Jesus' answer was very simple. First, he quotes the commandments, but he followed it up with a simple word that we've been looked at extensively last week. Love. Love. And then you go, okay, Pastor, how do we order our lives around love? How do we let that be the center focus? How do we do that? And then if we did do it, would it make any difference at all? Would we feel a little fuller, maybe healthier? What difference would it make? God requires us to have a movement. If God moves around the earth in creation and there's an order and an arrangement, then it means God wants us to be a part of that. And we've been learning in this Micah passage. We're in this series now called Do You Speak God? So we've been looking at Micah. This will be the third week we looked at it. And the message in there is very clear. God requires our lives to be ordered around Him. That means our lives are designed to move and hover and orient around a center focus, a center hub, and we call that here, people of faith, God. The center of God, God's will. Now, I went today and I'll tell you, we did confession already. I stole this tetherball off the playground out back. So if anybody goes back there today and wants to, it's not there. So not only did I steal that, I stole the flagpole. You don't notice this, but this came out of Anderson Hall. So don't tell anybody, but this is my prop. So this is my tetherball. You ever played tetherball? Everybody's played tetherball, right? So the concept of tetherball is a center anchored point, correct? Centered point. You have a tether that keeps the ball connected. And what's the goal? The tetherball moves around and around, doesn't it? Around and around the center post. And what's happening as it moves around? It's getting closer to the center. And the person that gets the ball closest to the center is the winner, right? You're the winner. When I think about God and I think about a center point, I think about the tetherball, God's will, center hub. We're created to rotate around that, moving toward that center focus. There's two types of rotation in the world, and this is not a lesson on physics, but I'm real quick. Two types of rotation in the world, and I think this is going to show up on the screens, I hope. One is centrifugal, and the other is centripetal. Now, those two, you might have learned about those in geometry. So the first, centripetal force, is defined as it's a component of force that's acting on a body in a curvular motion that is directed toward the center. Kind of like tetherball, right? Now, there's a second type of rotation, and you're seeing that in action right now. The second type of rotation is centrifugal, and that's that force that draws away. It's a rotating force that's moving away from the center. Have you got the two bits together in your head? Which one of those two best described your life? One moving toward the center, or one moving away? Last week we learned that those folks, the people of God that are following God's will, are those that have a center point and they circle around God's will. They circle around God's will. And we called that ahav, that Hebrew word for love. We talked a lot about that Hebrew word last week, ahav. So those that are centered on God's will are circling around. They circle around that essence of God's will, which is love, ahav. It's how we were created to move in our relationship with God. Anything else, I was talking to the confirmation class today, anything else from that we call sin, right? If we're moving away from God's will, it doesn't work. It leads to lots of disorder. It leads to chaos. So the tetherball moves properly, circling around the anchor point, because it is connected, right? It's connected. It's anchored to the center point. And the closer, the more it spins, the closer it comes to centering. It's a constant arrangement, okay? It's a movement. It's a constant arrangement, movement around the center point, ever closening, ever closening, ever closening, till it gets to the point. Micah 6:8, we've been looking at this forever, 6:8 and 6:9. The people of God, they've come off center. They've lost their center point. They don't know what it is. And so they come and they go, what do we do? And we looked at this, and here it is on the screen. The prophet says, He's told you, O mortals, what is good and what does the Lord require. what does the Lord require? What's the center point? What's the action? What to be anchored to? What should life rotate around? And the prophet says, do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So in other words, Israel's spinning in the wrong direction. And it caused their worship to be out of sorts. It caused their offerings to God to be crazy, out of order kinds of things they were offering to God when they were created to have that ever-rotating, ever-closening relationship anchored in God's love. The prophet says, what does the Lord require? The answer is very simple if you put these phrases together from the passage. A refocused life. If you want to know what does God want from you today, a refocused life based on God's love at the center. Refocused life based on God's love at the center. That's God's love language. It's expressed by the prophets, and you see how the prophet comes up with 3 ways to help us understand what it looks like to have God's will, God's love at the center and moving ever closer. What does it look like? It looks like justice. It looks like mercy and love. We're only going to look at one today. We're going to look at justice. That first movement, if we have a good anchoring point. That word for justice is misfah. It's used over 500 times in the Old Testament. It has that sense of to set upright. Okay, it's kind of an ordering. So this misfah here, do justice, that the prophet is calling out for. It refers to God's ordering of all life. In the beginning, God was hovering around, ordering life. So this is God's ordering. Justice, arranged. So when we think of the word justice, though, I think probably you think in terms of a rule of law. Or maybe like today, we put our hands on our heart and we did the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. And we said liberty and justice. We used the word for all, meaning that everyone is supposed to be treated equally in this country, fairly under the law. Now, the biblical idea of justice, it incorporates those ideas, or actually it's probably where the founders got those ideas from. But justice, biblically speaking, goes much, much further. The question is this. When we consider justice, whose justice are we seeking? Are we seeking really the will of God? Or are we just assuming kind of God's going to bless what happens to us? Whatever goes on, God will, bless it somehow because it feels right to us. And the word for that we use is called spin, right? We spin things in our favor, in our perspective, from our perspective, our perception. We spin truth. Now, justice has 2 types of spinning, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of the message today. 2 types of spinning. There's a justice that spins toward us, toward what happens to me, and the word for that is kind of, I think, is the secular understanding of justice. It's about the law. It involves retribution, maybe revenge, payback, satisfaction, pound of flesh, all those things that we want equal treatment, so we invoke the law. Now, when I was 18 years old, I was in my little Toyota Corolla, and I was stopped waiting to turn to go into my neighborhood. And I noticed these 2 headlights growing ever larger in my rearview mirror because there's a car speeding toward me, and they did not appear they were going to make the stop in time. The car actually runs into me at about 45 miles an hour, broke my seat back, and my neck hurt a little bit, but what I didn't realize is it started me on this long road that I'm on now of degenerative disc disease. So now I have a titanium plate in my neck, and it continues to get worse. Well, here's the thing. The guy hit me. He jumps in the back seat because he had no insurance and no driver's license, and he was drunk. You go, where's the justice in that? Now, that's that law justice. I remember I was getting ready, finishing up in graduate school, in undergrad. I'm off the seminary, very expensive, 3 years of graduate degree work. And so I'm going to Columbia Seminary in Atlanta. And Columbia had this really, really neat scholarship called Columbia Scholars that you had to have a certain grade point to receive that. Well, I came out of undergrad with a very high GPA, and I qualified for the Columbia Scholars. You know what that meant? Entire tuition paid. Guess what? They never told me about it. So I washed dishes for 3 years, and then I married Elisa. That's how I got through seminary, because she was working. Injustice, right? That's that first order of justice, spins toward me. Then the second type of justice, it rotates in a different direction. It moves out from me. This is a very different this is the biblical concept. It moves away. This is a justice that's ordered around God's will as the anchor point. And it moves toward others in acts of ahav, acts of service, acts of love, the kinds of things we talked about last week, acts toward our neighbor. The world would have us shift gears. Remember we talked about those rotating gears, and if you kind of mesh them wrong, the world would have us shift our gears so that we spin justice as Christians around ourselves. And I already talked to you about what happens if you go from one gear to the wrong gear. It's that grinding. That's chaos. The word for that is sin. Biblical justice, the prophet's talking about here, is not about what happens to us. It's what's happening in our relationship with God. That's justice. Where's our center point? Where's our anchor? And we act out of that. Justice is what we do. It's not what comes to us. So the prophet is saying to the people of God, let's reclaim this idea of justice, of doing justly. What the prophet says is, hey, let's begin to reorient and reorder our lives. In the beginning, chaos, God hovered around. Let's get back with the orientation of order being created. And let's make that anchor point God's will. And we know God's will means to love with ahav. That's the Hebrew word, love, toward my neighbor. I had that nomadic tent set up last week to represent the family of God's creation, that precious gift that we're supposed to take care of. That's that kind of love. What does it look like? What does it look like to be engaged in that just ordering that spins out from us? It's not about us, it's more what we do. Well, in this church, I can give you a couple of really concrete examples of what that spinning justice looks like. It looks like participating in the iDignity program, where we take folks that want to work, but they've lost all of their identity information. They may not have a driver's license, they may not have a social security number, and they can't get a job. So iDignity helps those folks get those things in line, because then they can actually get a job and be self-sufficient. That's justice spinning out. Or maybe it's a family that they have jobs, they've come across some hard times, they've lost their home, they're trying to get back in a home, they don't want to live in hotels or day to day. So there's a program called Family Promise we participate with. That where we help families come and have a place to live for maybe 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, to get enough of their life organized and ordered that they can be, once again, self-sufficient. That's a justice spinning out from us. Or it could be Grace and Grits, when we go to downtown Sanford, and I think maybe it's the Scouts have helped with that a few times. We go down there and we feed folks, maybe 200-300 folks that are hungry and need a hot meal. That's justice spinning out from us, acts of loving kindness. If justice is rotating around God's will, it looks like love. If justice rotates around us, it looks like law. And there's a difference. Jesus said, pick up your cross. We've heard that so many times. I'm not sure we understand what it means. If you look really hard at your life today, I would ask you this question: what is your center point? I walked into the senior high Sunday school today, and they were waiting for someone to show up. And so I said, well, why don't you think about answering this question? What do you think high school kids, what do you think their center point is in their life? Friends? Family? Recreation? Cell phones? Fun? What is pizza? What's the center? Pizza's mine. What's the center point? So I ask you that. What is your center point? What is it that you're organizing your life around, spinning around? Because can you imagine if we began to live with our anchor point being God and God's will, and we rotate around that, getting ever closer? Can you imagine that would change the way we relate to one another? Do you think people might, like us more? Feel cared about by us? Feel loved? Would our relationships be more full, healthier, if our justice moved out from us rather than focusing on ourselves? Spinning loving justice is interesting. I think if we're able to grab a hold of this, it would remove the obstacles that get in our way. Think about this. What are the obstacles that hinder godly relationships? It's stuff like blame, right? Christians, man, we can blame each other. What about retribution? They did that to me, I'll show them. Satisfaction, I'll get my pound of the flesh. These things are not spinning in the right way. Imagine if we spun out from ourselves. You would remove the kind of disappointment that we would expect from people. Being loved when we're anchored properly in God's love. I think people around us would they would want to be around us all the time. I think churches would be so full, we'd have to put more pews in here. Because people would feel loved. This type of spinning justice is far more powerful than any sense of sacrifice we might offer up. And that's what was happening in that Micah passage. Folks were offering up these crazy sacrifices, and God said, those mean nothing to me. They're going in the wrong direction. What you need is a center. We would say, what is the center? Maybe Jesus is the center of it all. Jesus, we sang a song this morning at the first service, Jesus at the center of it all. And I think that's right. But if you mean his words, center on his words, well, you have to pay attention to what he said. And that was the passage that Pat read today out of Matthew, where it talked about you're neglecting the weightier things that matter, like justice and mercy we'll talk about next week. Those are the things that need to be moving out from us. If Jesus is the center of it all, those things should be naturally occurring and moving out. So what's your center? Some people say, well, the church is the center. I don't think Jesus would say that. Some people say, well, it's I don't know, maybe it's my prayer life is the center. I don't think Jesus would say that either. I think if Jesus walked in today and you asked him, what should be the center point? I think he'd say love. The sacrifice of love. Expressed in that Hebrew notion of ahav, toward God's family. Jesus said, pick up your cross. And we think of that as this idea of sacrifice, don't we? We're going to pick up the cross. It's so heavy. And you see those images during Passion Week of all the movies of Jesus. And I don't want to look like that. I don't want to experience that. I don't want to look like that. That looks terrible. Is that what it means? Is that what sacrifice is going to mean? I'm going to pick up that? And I think it scares people away. And maybe there's something to that. Maybe we've misunderstood picking up the cross, what that sacrifice looks like. I think picking up the cross probably looks more like having a center focus of God and God's will in your life and carrying that. Picking up the cross means focusing on God's love and getting ever closer, ever closer, ever closer to God's will. I think that's a better explanation of what Jesus was talking about when he said, pick up the cross. That's what he did. His love spun out. Think about this. On the cross, what's happening? God's love is spinning out through Jesus toward us. It's not pulled in toward Jesus. He didn't give his life for himself. Think about the rotation. Think about the arrangement. It was justice, loving justice, spun out for everyone. Love moving toward you and moving toward me in the greatest act of service, love the world has ever known. Amen.